When Donald Trump entered the White House in 2017, one of the first crises waiting for him was North Korea. Kim Jong-un had already tested nuclear weapons, paraded long-range missiles, and taunted the United States with threats of destruction. Trump's response swung between personal insults on Twitter and carefully staged moments of diplomacy. In the background, America's intelligence agencies struggled with a glaring weakness. Despite decades of effort, they had almost no reliable sources inside North Korea. Satellite images could reveal missile launch sites or troop movements, but they could not explain Kim's intentions. Human spies were nearly impossible to recruit in a country where the regime watched every citizen. Signals intelligence, the interception of phone calls or digital communications, was blocked by one of the most tightly controlled networks on Earth. For American decision-makers, North Korea was a dangerous blind spot. In 2018, as nuclear negotiations crept forward, a new opportunity appeared. Engineers had developed a small but powerful device that could intercept and relay encrypted communications if placed near the right nodes in North Korea's networks. It was not the kind of thing satellites or drones could deliver. Someone had to plant it by hand in the dead of night on hostile soil. That task fell to the most secretive warriors in the U.S. arsenal, SEAL Team 6. Officially known as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, or DEVGRU, Team 6 was famous for the 2011 raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Within DEVGRU, the Red Squadron was selected. These men had a reputation for aggression and daring, the sort of operators who could be trusted with missions that bordered on impossible, but they would not go alone. To get ashore, they needed specialists in undersea infiltration. That role belonged to SEAL Delivery Vehicle Team 1, or SDV-1, based in Pearl Harbor. For decades, SDV-1 had mastered the art of piloting mini-submarines or wet subs that allowed SEALs to slip undetected beneath harbors and coastlines. The partnership of Red Squadron and SDV-1 created a hybrid task force, shooters trained for violence of action, and pilots trained for silent entry through the sea. Preparation began in late 2018 once President Trump personally signed the order. The SEALs were told that this mission was more politically sensitive than almost anything since the bin Laden raid. If things went wrong, they might not only be killed or captured, but could trigger a war between two nuclear powers. The rehearsals were relentless. In freezing waters off the American coast, SDV-1 crews practiced hours-long dives in mini-subs, while Red Squadron operators waited crammed in the back, soaked to the bone. They rehearsed surfacing, stripping out of diving gear, moving with weapons through rocky terrain, and then reversing the process under pressure. They tested the new listening device, learned light images for months, memorizing when small boats appeared, when lights flickered in villages, when tides left rocks exposed. It was the best they could do without drones overhead. Inside Red Squadron, the mood was serious but confident. These were men accustomed to operating in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, places where firefights and raids were the daily rhythm of war. But North Korea was different. Here, failure could not be patched over by airstrikes or reinforcements. Capture would mean torture, show trials, and potentially the collapse of nuclear negotiations. The men joked grimly about being pawns in a geopolitical game, but the reality weighed on them. By early 2019, as Trump prepared for a summit with Kim in Vietnam, the plan was finalized. A nuclear-powered submarine, almost 2 football fields long, would carry the strike team into the waters off North Korea. From there, SDV-1 pilots would launch 2 wet subs, each carrying several Red Squadron operators. After 2 hours submerged in 40-degree water, the SEALs would surface near shore, swim in silently, plant the device, and return before dawn. It was a mission built on thin margins and absolute trust. Every man knew that even the smallest mistake, a noisy splash, a misplaced sub, a fisherman in the wrong place could unravel months of preparation. As February opened, the final order was given. Trump approved the launch. The submarine went dark, entering a communications blackout as it crept closer to enemy waters. In the belly of the vessel, the Red Squadron operators checked their gear one last time. Unmarked rifles, ammunition that could never be traced, dive equipment packed tight. The SDV-1 pilots reviewed navigation points, each second plotted against currents and tides. Hours later, the hatches opened. Cold water rushed in. The SEALs slid into their mini-subs, huddled in silence as the presidency began. A mission into darkness that demanded everything and promised nothing. The submarine crept through the Pacific depths, its nuclear engines throttled low to reduce noise. Every man aboard knew they were entering one of the most surveilled maritime zones in the world. North Korea stood the misery that awaited them. The ride would last nearly 2 hours in 40-degree water. Muscles would cramp, faces would burn with cold, communication between subs would be hand signals and muffled radio clicks, nothing more. But all of that had been rehearsed. What had not been rehearsed was what would happen if anything unexpected appeared in their path. When the captain announced the final approach, the submarine entered total communications blackout. No one topside in Washington could reach them now. The operators exchanged quiet nods. This was it. The hatches opened, seawater flooding into the bay. One by one, the two mini-subs slid free of the mother vessel. Their small electric motors purred, barely louder than the ocean itself. The cockpit sealed, gauges flickered, and the pilots eased the craft into formation. Behind them, the submarine disappeared into the black, leaving only the faint trace of bubbles. Inside the wet subs, Red Squadron sat rigid, rifles pressed tight, eyes closed against the sting of salt water. They trusted the SDV-1 pilots, men who had spent careers mastering underwater infiltration. These pilots knew how to read sonar-like language, how to feel the pulse of the sea against the hull, how to navigate by nothing but compass and instinct. For an hour, the mini-subs crept forward. Through their night vision goggles, the SEALs could see little more than outlines of rocks and the faint glow of phosphorescent plankton. The coastline loomed closer. So far, the intelligence had been correct. No patrol boats, no radar sweeps, no lights on shore. But special operations missions live in the gap between prediction and reality. As the first sub settled onto the seafloor at the designated parking site, everything seemed on schedule. The second sub, however, overshot its mark. In the darkness, the pilot had misjudged the current. He was forced to circle back, turning the craft so that when it finally stopped, it faced the wrong direction. It was a small error, the kind of thing that could be corrected later. But in an operation where silence and precision meant survival, even small errors had weight. With time slipping away, the shore team decided not to wait. The sliding doors opened, and the SEALs slipped into the frigid water. They kicked silently toward the surface, rifles slung tight, packs carrying the listening device tethered to their sides. Every few yards, they surfaced just enough to scan the horizon with goggles. Nothing. The shore appeared empty, just as intelligence had promised. They crawled onto the rocks, stripped out of their dive gear, and checked weapons. Unmarked rifles, ammunition without stampings. Each man a ghost, armed for a mission that officially did not exist. Their target lay only a few hundred yards inland. If they moved quickly and quietly, they could install the device and vanish before anyone knew they had come. But the sea had other plans. Distance distorted by refraction, it seemed harmless. But from the perspective of the shore team, the boat was practically on top of the subs. In the dark, featureless sea, proximity became guesswork. With radios silent, no one could clarify the threat. The SEALs were on their own, forced to interpret the situation without command oversight. Was it a patrol deliberately searching for intruders? Or simply fishermen in the wrong place at the wrong time? A splash broke the tension. One of the North Koreans had entered the water. To the SEALs, this felt like discovery. Every operator knew the rule drilled into them for months. If compromised, abort immediately. But there was another rule, equally clear. No witnesses. If anyone saw them, the entire mission, and perhaps international stability itself, could collapse. The senior enlisted SEALs on shore raised his weapon. He did not need to speak. He simply centered his rifle and fired. Suppressed shots cracked the silence. Other SEALs followed instinctively, cutting down the figures on the boat before they could react. The silence of the sea was shattered. The mission had just entered a new phase, one no rehearsal could prepare them for. The suppressed gunfire snapped across the waves, short bursts that to any bystander might have sounded like nothing more than the sea breaking on rocks. But for the men on the beach, it was the sound of a mission collapsing. Their rifles lowered, eyes scanning, the SEALs felt the heavy truth settle. They had been forced to act. The rules had been drilled into them for months. If compromised, abort immediately. But aborting was not as simple as turning around. To survive, and to preserve the secrecy of the operation, they could not allow themselves to be seen. The boat that had drifted so close, its flashlights cutting across the surface, had become the single greatest threat to the entire mission. If those men had spotted the subs, or worse, seen armed Americans waiting ashore, the fallout would have been immediate. Radio calls to shore security alerts, and soon, a swarm of soldiers converging on their position. The shore team swam fast toward the vessel. Their movements were sharp, hurried, driven by the urgency of the moment. When they climbed aboard, it became clear that the people they had shot were not uniformed troops. No weapons, no radios, no insignia. Just heavy wetsuits, primitive dive gear, and baskets. Shellfish divers. Civilians who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. For a brief moment, there was silence. Some of the operators let the reality sink in. Their mission, to plant a listening device, had just turned into a desperate struggle to escape without triggering a war. They could not stay. The decision was immediate. Time lost here meant North Korean patrols had more chance to converge. If the divers had seen anything on detection by sonar and radar, or abandoned the men to fend for themselves, there was no hesitation. He ordered the vessel into shallower waters, throttling forward despite the danger. For long minutes, the SEALs clung to the wet subs, the black hull of the submarine finally looming above them like a wall of steel. Hatches opened, crew rushed to pull them in. The mini-subs were dragged back into their cradles, dripping as the last operator hauled himself through the hatch. The submarine wasted no time. Its engines surged, carrying it back into deeper waters. The mission was over. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. The Red Squadron operators stripped out of soaked wetsuits, their bodies trembling from the hours in frigid water. The SDV-1 pilots sat in silence, replaying every detail. The overshoot on insertion, the repositioning maneuver, the cockpit lights. Each small deviation now seemed monumental. The debrief began almost immediately. What had gone wrong? Some argued that the boat had simply been bad luck, civilians in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Others pointed to the small mistakes, the misaligned subs, the decision to correct position with cockpit lights open. None of it changed the outcome. The device remained unplanted. The mission had failed. But beyond failure lay the greater question: what would the North Koreans conclude? Hours later, confirmation arrived from U.S. satellites. Activity along the coast had spiked. Convoys of trucks rolled toward the shoreline. Communications flared between local bases. Patrols fanned out into the water. But there were no public statements, no accusations, no threats of retaliation. The silence was unsettling. Perhaps Pyongyang believed its divers had drowned in an accident. Perhaps it suspected more, but chose not to escalate. Either way, the risk of exposure still loomed. Back in Washington, the timing was delicate. President Trump was days away from a summit with Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. Canceling would raise questions. Proceeding might risk walking into a trap if Kim knew what had happened. The White House chose the path of silence. The mission would not be acknowledged to Congress. No word would be shared with oversight committees. To the world, it had never taken place. For the operators, though, it could not be erased. Months of rehearsal, endless dives in cold seas, careful preparation all undone in a single encounter with a civilian boat. The knowledge weighed heavily. Special operations thrived on precision, yet here, despite all their skill, the margin for error had been razor thin. And yet, every man knew this was part of the game. Not every mission goes as planned. Sometimes the smallest chance encounter can unravel months of work. For every failure that leaks into the public eye, there are countless missions that succeed in silence operations that never make headlines, achievements hidden behind layers of classification. SEAL Team 6. Should units like SEAL Team 6 continue to shoulder such high-risk clandestine tasks, missions that could ignite international crises? Or should they be reserved for more traditional roles like direct action raids and hostage rescues? Within Red Squadron and SDV-1, the answer was simple. They had done their job. They had trained relentlessly, executed with discipline, and reacted as best they could when fate intervened. No mission was ever guaranteed. Not every plan survived contact with reality. Operators accepted that risk when they donned their gear. To them, what mattered most was that everyone had made it out alive. But in Washington, politics demanded a different calculus. Trump's administration kept the mission buried. No mention was made to the oversight committees. No acknowledgement was given to the families of the civilians who had been killed. And no lessons were shared with the broader public